to protect this inanimate thing called nature. So nature does need protection. So part of what love is, love ultimately ends in duty. And the duty is a beautiful duty. And duty is part of what brings meaning and purpose to life. So if you want to know yourself, examine your history of what you have loved. And if you've never put it that way, you can do it now. You can run through your whole life and ask yourself, whom have I loved in this expanded sense? Ask yourself to action. Most of us go through life not knowing quite how to act upon what I'll call, if you don't mind my using the term, those spiritual duties and again, in a metaphoric way, and sometimes actual way, a spiritual debt. Now, if you can look at your life this way, this is one way, this love is one way of knowing yourself. What have you loved? What have you done about it? That's a way of knowing yourself. Another way of knowing yourself, remember, we're after the sacred fire, the sacred fountain. Another way of knowing yourself is justice. Now, many people have been very hurt in life by things that are unjust and unfair. Even people say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in metaphysical ideas. Everything is just random. There's no meaning. These same people become extremely offended when something unjust has occurred. Now, I only bring this up when I'm teaching a group of people that want to know my conception of the divine, and I found the people that are angriest about that there is no God sometimes are the people most passionately involved in social justice. Okay? How do you figure that out? They're rejecting the idea of the three O's and the B, the God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, and benevolent. They just say that can't be because of the injustice. From my perspective, they know the world through justice. And although they might not admit it, maybe they just was never taught well. When I think of the designing the ideal Hebrew school, which Mirav and I tried to do all these years, and part of it was discussing these kinds of things, that even if you don't believe in the divine, being passionate about justice is one way to know the divine, meaning to know what is just and unjust. Now, I'm going to go back to Aristotle a bit here. Aristotle would say it's actually worth your time thinking about it, because thinking about what is just, what is fair, takes disciplined knowledge. And one thing that frustrates me oftentimes is people to say, that's good, that's bad, that's fair, that's not just. And I ask them to explain it. They don't have more than 2 sentences. It's emotion-driven. Now, sometimes justice is initially driven by compassion and emotion, but it has to be filled up with some really good thinking, because we might be enlisted in causes that we get for which we are emotionally aroused, but actually don't create justice. So this is where, by the way, rationality is another way of knowing. I believe that rationality is embedded in justice. I didn't put rationality as one of the love, justice, truth, and beauty. I'll put rationality under truth. But if you're passionate about justice, fairness, creating good and bad, you have to be theoretically coherent, or you might end up doing very bad things. Of course, I'm commenting on what's happening on college campuses today. It just hurts me to say it. People are pro-Hamas. What happens to the life of a human being that they are pro-Hamas? They're in support of what happened on October 7th. What happens in the life of a human being, that they supported Nazism and the predatory behavior of Mao and Stalin and ISIS? People got swept up to and thought that torture and atrocities were a good thing, that's what they had to do. I think this is a disfigured human being. I'll go even more than that. The fact that some people can't even have a reasoning conversation in the search of understanding good and evil about Israel means there's some kind of knowing of self and knowing the world that is just shut down. I think those who cannot have a rational conversation about what is good and what is bad and so forth, I think there's some kind of intellectual and spiritual damage there, personally. I'm not saying it's not repairable. And again, one reason why I think the damage is there is because people don't spend time perfecting as much as they can their understanding of justice, and therefore they just believe what someone else tells them. Now, if you look at Plato and Aristotle, these are the worst ways to know things. This is the worst way to know something important, is just to accept uncritically the opinions of other people, which is one of the main ways people get their information. TikTok, Instagram, social media. If it's on the net, it must be true. By the way, one of my favorite relatively unknown books, and you can find a reprint, written in 1688, if I'm not mistaken, by Isaac Watts, W-A-T-T-S. I think it's called The Improvement of the Mind or something like this. Very much influenced by Francis Bacon. I love the book, by the way. There was a time when I was giving this book to everybody that I knew, and I realized I was probably just propping up uneven tables. But it's a fabulous, fabulous book by Isaac Watts, The Improvement of Something. And page by page by page, he talks about, in the 1600s, all of the ways that people fail, especially in seeking justice, because they just accept opinions. They never think anything through. They don't have axioms. They don't just care to know facts. Well, how can you dispense justice if you can't know facts? If you're just driven by emotion, that you can't even describe what is just and true and good. So look at yourself, look at your history of passions, and ask yourself, was that justice by opinion or justice verified by knowledge, by rationality? Now, that's one way of knowing yourself. I mean, I've looked at myself and I know that I have been very, very wrong about things because I accepted the opinions of others. Now, what happens when you start to think for yourself, you lose your tribe, you lose your group, because some tribes and some groups say, you have to have this knowledge. And I say, well, I have some of that knowledge, but some of that is actually not true. Well, then you're out of the group. So one of the problem of, in the line of Aristotle and Plato and Maimonides and many others, the unfettered mind trying to know justice is sometimes a homeless mind, a homeless self, until you find other people, who are interested in justice more than they're interested in opinions. So knowing the world through justice is another way of knowing the world through God. It's a way of knowing the self. And review what you know. Review yourself as a knower of knowing the world through love, knowing yourself through love. I'm going to save truth and beauty for next time. I just want to review very briefly what I've taught today. When one talks about self-knowledge, I don't want to suggest the idea that there is something called a self to know. But I use the term, but try to think, examine how myself knows. Now, knowledge here in the esteemed level in Plato and Aristotle, and I'll put Maimonides here, which is something sublime, something that one can apply to a local political issue all the way to the knowledge of God. Now, that's what we essentially are as human beings, is knowers. I mean, we're doers and we're knowers. There's a few other things I could put in there, but right now I'm talking about the ways that we know. Now, now this is a mysterious thing when I talk about you, which means who's doing the knowing. I won't go into that today. But there's something about the mystery of the will to engage in this authentic journey of knowing, examining each of these different parts I've taken straight from the Kabbalah, love, justice, truth, and beauty. You can use another system. And in some act of will, decide to knowing in this way, decide to knowing using this tool. Now, I believe this kind of knowing animates the knowledge of the divine, because ultimately you have to ask yourself, you have to know, there are actually better and worse ways to love. There are better and worse ways to advocate for justice. I mean, there's the ignorant, opinion-baited way, and a way, and there's actually, you might say, the path of truth. Now, I say, well, then what is that? What is that standard for the better knowing of love, justice, truth, and beauty? Well, I'll call it the divine, call it whatever you want, but it is certainly not a human fabrication. So, by self-knowledge, again, I'm borrowing this from the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Maimonidean tradition of how you know the world, knowing as a sacred faculty. By the way, when you study Kabbalah, those of you who have studied Kabbalah will see this immediately. The upper three mystical sfirot are called Chokhmah, wisdom, which means the generative point of reality. Doesn't mean wisdom as we normally think about it. Its mate is Binah, which is means discernment in Hebrew, but here it means something like ramified reality. Chokhmah is the point in geometrically that does exist and does not exist until it has extension. So Binah is understood to be the extension of the generative point of reality. So we have the infinite, generative point, extended point, and then the lower seven sfirot. And Kabbalistic masters, especially in the Hasidic tradition, have asked, what's the connection between these two? What mediates between the higher sfirot and the lower seven sfirot? Because you have the three higher ones, the infinite, Chokhmah, and Binah. Remember, they're labels. That's not how the words are understood in Kabbalah. And then the lower seven. What mediates between the upper three and the lower seven? Well, they call this the hidden sphira. The hidden sphira of da'at, of knowing. And by the way, this is a little question you can ask them. It says, I'm studying Kabbalah. You say, hey, that's wonderful. Can you describe the 10 sfirot? If they can't, they're not studying Kabbalah. I don't know what they're studying, but they're not studying Kabbalah. And if they can give you a rundown of the sfirot, they're studying Kabbalah. And then you can say, and what's the hidden sphira? They would say, oh, are we talking about da'at? I'm up and ready and willing to go into the deeper recesses of the idea of da'at. So the knowing is what connects the upper sfirot to the lower sfirot. Now, so for me, being, again, it's who's doing this knowing, who is knowing through love, justice, truth, and beauty. It's a very, very nuanced question, but I think there's a decision to know the world in these ways. I think that is the authentic self. Again, there's not an authentic self that is in a fixed position that you discover when you meditate. The image I used before was you open a door and there's your authentic self just sitting there, right? It's actually the person who is opening the doors, the person who is seeking out the dimensions of the soul. That is the authentic self. So from my perspective, it's hard for me to imagine a person that I would call an authentic person if they're not doing some version of this work. Because this is, you might say, the authentic purpose and meaning of our being starts in this work and then gets translated down into everything that we do. As I did last night, I will take one pointed question, just one pointed question. Then I'll take a quick break, and Abigail will conclude our service. Okay, so think amongst yourselves for a moment. Let's see. All right, I don't see a question. I think I've been either abundantly obscure or abundantly clear. I'm not sure which, but you can review this on YouTube, and you can tell me. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's really great seeing you. Really grateful to you for creating this minyan, creating this holy community on Shabbat morning. Very grateful to all our members and supporters who have acted on their gratitude and helped keep this alive. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your support, moral support, and otherwise. Shabbat Shalom.